Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third in our book talk series with Meghan O'Rourke. We're very excited to have Meghan here to talk about her bestseller and 2022 National Book Award finalist, The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness. Before we start, and before I introduce Meghan, just a reminder, and for those of you, if you don't know who we are, Solve MECFS Initiative. We are a nonprofit in this space. We fund research and advocacy to try to find treatments and cures for ME/CFS, long COVID, and other post-infection long haul diseases. We also advocate in Washington for more government supportive research and recognition of these illnesses as the serious medical conditions that they are. And in addition, one of the other things we do is we provide webinars like this with a variety of voices from science, government, patients, and the arts. And so if you'd like to support our work, instructions on how to do so are on the screen, and thank you. All right, so let's start our conversation with Meghan. First, Meghan O'Rourke is a best-selling author, poet, editor, and podcaster. Her work often tackles challenging subjects such as chronic illness and grief, about which she also has firsthand experience. Meghan is recipient of numerous literary awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, and the Union League Prize for Poetry from the Poetry Foundation. She is also editor of the Yale Review, and her writing has appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, the New Yorker, and the New York Times. Meghan, welcome to our webinar. Particularly, you have been traveling extensively in Europe, I think, promoting your book. So we really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, with our folks today.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Yeah.
So why don't we start by just sort of giving us an overview of your book, what inspired you to write it, and what's the response been, and what do you think about that?
Yeah. So, let's see, where to begin? So the book is an account of my own experience of getting slowly ill, and in ways that no one could understand. No medical provider I saw could understand or identify, starting when I was about 21, although possibly going further back in time even. So the book recounts my own experience of going through this roller coaster of symptoms and getting slowly sicker and sicker without any answers, and tries to stop and draw on my skills as a journalist and researcher to really ask the question of, why is this experience actually such a common one for those of us who have complex chronic illnesses, especially illnesses that are what we might call infection-associated illnesses, such as ME, such as chronic Lyme disease or post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, now long COVID, so many others that I'm not even going to be able to name right now. So in other words, I wanted to both offer an account of the lived experience of one person living with these illnesses in ways that would bring some attention to and understanding of, I think, the maddening, puzzling, challenging experience of having, sometimes an unrecognized or invalidated illness, and also just the challenges of a day-to-day life when you don't know what tomorrow holds, right? It's hard for you to say yes to that family reunion because you don't know how you're going to feel that day. It's hard to hold a job because you don't know from day to day what your energy levels are going to be. But, I really wanted it to be more than a memoir because I wanted to help the medical establishment and myself and other patients and other families and colleagues of patients understand why we're so behind on our knowledge about these illnesses, right? Which is where an organization like Solve ME is doing such important work. And also why these illnesses seem to unfortunately intersect with the medical establishment at its weak points, right? If we live in a medical system that's very good at acute illness or, taking care of you after a car accident, it's much less good at the complexities and emotional necessities of chronic illness care, which I think requires a totally different kind of framework for the human body, the human need for contact, all of those things. So hopefully that's a little bit of a summary of the book. I'll say briefly, just the reception has been astonishing to me. I'll confess here, really nervous about putting this in the world, even though I've been writing about myself and my illness since 2013. It still felt vulnerable to put all this down and put it out there, and to offer a systemic critique. And I think it's been really heartening to see the world receive it, and to see also medical schools receive it and ask me to come talk about chronic illness care. So I'll just say that for now.
Well, but I think that's a very important point, because your experience, even in just getting diagnosed, mirrors what probably almost all of our patients on this webinar and in the community have had, right? Tell us about some of the obstacles you had to getting diagnosed, because I think that dovetails exactly with what you said about the medical community understanding the disease.
Yeah, so I think, my story is unfortunately probably going to sound familiar to a lot of people here. In some ways I look back and I think, right, in some ways maybe I've always had symptoms, but certainly right after I graduated from college in the late 90s, as a 21-year-old, I started having very extreme neurological sensations where I was walking to work one morning and it felt like a swarm of bees had attacked me and was stinging me, like just these incredibly painful stinging sensations and electric, like pin sensations all over my body. So severe that I actually couldn't walk. I had to stop and rub my legs until it stopped. And this began happening every day. And at the same time, I developed extreme vertigo, which I'd never had. I had been a gymnast who was used to, flipping in the air and having what Simone Biles famously taught us, right? It was air sense. Suddenly I didn't have any air sense. It was hard even to walk up and down stairs because I couldn't quite judge where the stairs were. Began having bouts of really intense fatigue, but feeling very quickly as a writer that fatigue didn't even describe the experience. It was an approximate term for what I was undergoing, which felt more like all the little factories of energy making in my body. My mitochondria had stopped making energy, right? And that to the point where it'd be hard to just move my arms and walk across the room. And then very strong sense that like I had the flu all the time. And these symptoms would come and go, but I went to the doctor and I said, I have these little strange electrical sensations all over my body. And he was like, well, maybe you have a little dry skin, try more lotion. And I was like, no, this really doesn't seem like dry skin. It seems very profound. But maybe it could be caused by dry skin. So, I kind of went from doctor to doctor saying it really feels like something's wrong, and being met with, sometimes a certain gracious, let's do some tests. But then when the tests didn't show anything definitive, very quickly, the questions I got were, are you experiencing a lot of anxiety at work? Are you, depressed? And, I was a young person with a really intense job. And I said, well, sure, I'm quite stressed. And of course, I'm a little anxious. So maybe that's it. But in my heart of hearts, I didn't believe they were right, but I was so acculturated to trust the medical opinion of these experts that I have to say it saddens me now, but I look back and for 10 years, I really took what they said at face value. And I spent a decade questioning my own perceptions and thinking that in some way, maybe I was just kind of bad at living, and it really took a crisis to in my health to kind of be able to say, no, I'm really sick. You're wrong. Something's wrong. And I actually know enough about myself and my body to be able to say that.
That's hard though, because I think our tendency as humans is that when we're in the presence of somebody who, in theory, has much more knowledge and much more specific knowledge than we have on something, like a doctor, to do like what you said, to take what you were being told at face value. Did you learn anything in that process that might help anyone who sees this talk or reads the book about how we can advocate for ourselves on our own medical care? Because I think, to just be real succinct about what you're saying, it's easy if there is a test that can show what is wrong with you. But here we're talking about a series of illnesses that don't show that, or we don't know what to look at yet.
Yeah.
So how can people sort of advocate for their own care in that way?
Yeah. I think that, what I would go back and tell my younger self is that, first of all, we have to trust ourselves, right? And that honoring your own impulses and instincts is really just the place to begin. And unfortunately, as we all maybe know, when the world is reflecting a different reality back at us, it can be quite easy to question ourselves, even as we know firmly in some part of ourselves what's going on. So I think one thing I did learn pretty quickly is that or I know now rather, is that if someone isn't acting like a partner in your care in the way you need them to, probably not worth staying with that doctor. I think I spent a lot of time trying to get people to be partners in care as if I were in like a bad relationship. And it took a long time to really stop and say, you know what, I deserve this care. I need this care. And these are not people who are equipped to give it to me. And that doesn't mean if there's a doctor you really do connect with, not taking the time to educate them and be in dialogue with them. Obviously, all relationships are a dialogue. But when you meet someone who just isn't listening, they're not going to start listening. So I think that the number one step is really finding a person with whom you feel it's worth your time to be in dialogue, and then advocating for yourself by, if need be, having someone come with you to the doctor's appointment to say, she's doing, it felt weird, like almost always I was doing better on the days I had to see a doctor than not. And I think that must be something about adrenaline or whatever. But, having someone come with you to say, this is what I've seen, this is what she's saying is true, and here's how I see it. Also just to take notes, because I would become quite emotionally overwhelmed in doctor's appointments and often forget a lot of what was said. Also, if you have brain fog, it can be hard to retain information. So in addition to taking notes, I found it really helpful to have people come. But I think, finding community and through advocacy groups and through online, I think helps all of us have that sense that, this isn't just about me, this is about something larger. And actually, we all merit this attention and care, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And it sounds like you've sort of taken on a little bit of this job. You talk about how you're talking in medical schools and medical institutions to try to educate them. And we've already had a couple of questions in our Q&A about that.
Yeah.
How are you doing that? And how can we try to educate these large, the Kaiser Permanentes of the world, or the medical schools who are churning out new doctors all the time? How do we do that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think we do need better journalism and media recognition of these illnesses. So obviously that's something that I'm quite personally devoted to and will continue to be writing about, long COVID and ME and chronic Lyme disease. I think too, we need to target and find those change makers who are open-minded and understand the scope of the problem, the reality of the problem, and have a kind of intellectual curiosity. In a sense, what's most stacked against us is systemic, right? It's systemic inertia, systemic incuriosity. I think people become incurious when they're overwhelmed. And I think, unfortunately, many doctors and healthcare workers are quite overwhelmed by the bureaucratic requirements imposed on them by insurance companies, by the government, right? So I try in the book, although I'm critical of the medical establishment and in many ways of the doctors I saw, I try to really focus it on, this is a systemic problem, so we need systemic solutions. So I think, advocacy, information, connecting places like Kaiser Permanente with researchers who are doing really groundbreaking work around long COVID. There's just a huge amount of groundbreaking work happening that I think is going to really help and has a lot of relevance to ME and certainly to chronic Lyme disease too. And I think, talking to various groups, I've been saying, this is a moment where there's funding and curiosity. And I think the messaging just has to be a sustained message of, we're here too. This has been a long time. We need answers. And answering some of the questions we have is going to help a much larger, it's going to help many, many, many people. That's unsatisfying. I know, I wish I had like the solution, but I think we just keep doing it and keep focusing on the system has to change. It needs to develop really good strategies for the care of complex chronic illness and be strategic, like that this is going to help insurance companies spend less money over time, that this is going to help them deliver better care. When you give people answers, they often want to take them, right? What's hard for people is, oh, I don't know how to fix it, right? But the more we can give like really detailed information and collated studies, the more you'll start to see change. I think. Hope.
We hope. You mentioned long COVID, which, not to get into a debate whether long COVID is or is not ME/CFS, there's certainly some similarities, other diseases, but what I think can't be debated is that long COVID is kind of like you said, a game changer for complex chronic diseases.
Yeah.
Because whereas perhaps the populations were sort of small and more invisible previously to that, now it is a very, very visible thing. How does that change the field, the game plan? I'm also curious, not to get too much off on a tangent, but did you have your idea for this book before long COVID? Like, were you going to write this book anyway? And how did long COVID sort of shape the narrative?
Yeah, well, I'll tackle that part first, which is, I started writing this book in 2013. So I was actually almost done with the book when the pandemic hit. So I watched SARS-CoV-2, in China and what was happening there, and kind of realized, okay, this is probably going to be a global pandemic. And then very quickly had that sickening feeling that I'm sure many of us had of, this is a global pandemic. We're going to be seeing a lot of infection-associated chronic illness. So we have two problems on our hands, the acute wave and then the chronic wave that is going to follow. So I began pretty early on, like lurking on, I was already on all these message boards for my own sake, right? And so I was on a lot of message boards on Facebook and elsewhere, watching to hear what people who had COVID here in the United States in that wave in March were reporting, and very quickly saw that people were talking about ongoing symptoms. So I think that the other thing and so in terms of the book, I really realized that I had to talk about long COVID and that was going to change the book a little bit, because I didn't want to just have a superficial mention of it. Like, here's this thing. I really wanted to try to account a bit for how that was going to shift the problem I was talking about and contribute, right? So I think the other piece that's really important about long COVID, in addition to what you mentioned, is that not only is it a large group, and a group, by the way, that includes a lot of healthcare workers who were on the front lines in March 2020, but it is a group of people who are sick, and we have a very clear onset of sickness. We know it was caused by SARS-CoV-2, right? We know it was caused by COVID-19 when they got there. So I think one of the challenges for ME over the years has been people say, I'm sick, I think maybe it was this virus or it was this, but there hasn't been a really clear causative agent, right? And so it's been harder for researchers to get funding to study. And there's just been much more disbelief. So the combination of scope and clear onset, as you say, it makes it less invisible and hard to ignore. Similarly true with Lyme, although a lot of Lyme patients would say I was fine until I got Lyme disease, and then I had all these baffling symptoms. Because people were getting sick at different times, and because very quickly there was a kind of mobilization that Lyme disease didn't cause chronic illness, it was hard for people to persuade the medical establishment that these now ongoing symptoms were triggered by that. But, to have not only such a clear causative agent, but have so many people at the same time get it, it's a game changer. Finally, funding, right? So much research is just driven by funding. So we have a lot of funding for long COVID, and that means there's a lot of research being done. And I think one thing that's really encouraging to me, I'm writing a long piece about long COVID right now, is in the research that I've been shadowing, traveling across the country, talking to researchers, they are thinking about long COVID as part of this cluster of conditions that they think of as infection-associated chronic illness. And I would say, it may take some time for this to hit your GP, down the street. But in research, there's a kind of paradigm shift starting to take place of clustering and thinking about infection-associated complex chronic illness as a category of disease we have really neglected with tragic effects for far too long. And researchers are not only interested in this, but they are finding very concrete, actionable things that, while devastating to be in the room witnessing, I have to say, is strangely also encouraging, because I've been watching, being like, wow, they are going to find possible treatments. Like, there will be possible drugs, there will be possible therapies. It may be complicated, it may be imperfect, but I feel I toggle between being pessimistic, because it's depressing to watch how we're flubbing many things about the pandemic, and feeling really optimistic watching researchers, because the researchers, they are just working so hard and finding out so much. The last thing I'll say is that one of the things I really came to understand writing The Invisible Kingdom and doing, almost a decade of research, was that if you look at history, as soon as we start to understand the biological mechanisms of a disease, and as soon as we start to have some treatments, the entire way of thinking about and narrativizing that disease changes. It happens like this. The first step comes when there's a biological mechanism, but the second step really comes when there's some treatments. And that's what gives me some optimism. Again, I wish it were happening faster. It's long overdue. It is a travesty that it has taken this long, that all of us have been stigmatized in the ways we have been. But I do think we're at some kind of inflection point, and that medicine 50 years from now is going to look really different. Yeah.
I think it would be a great solace to a lot of people, even if there was simply a test that a doctor could run that would tell she or he, this is what this person has, or if not specifically what that is, at least what group it is.
Yeah.
Because there's all of this other, like you said, you were made to feel, sorry, I forgot the exact phrase, but you were sort of questioning yourself when you were talking to doctors. And I think a lack of a clear test for a diagnosis causes that in a lot of people. How did you sort of get through that and work through that and come back from that?
Come back from, say that again.
From the idea of sort of feeling like maybe the problem
was me.
Was you, right? Not.
I mean,
they just didn't have the answers.
It took like more than a decade for me to start really pushing for answers. So those first neurological symptoms started when I was 21, and it wasn't until after my mother died, when I was 32. So it wasn't until I was like 33 that I started getting some small answers, and it wasn't really until I was like 35 that I was like, something's really wrong. So that's 14 years of my life. It's astonishing, actually, when I think about it. And somewhat gutting, but that was 14 years of me internalizing this message that I should, that I was okay and that I should just muscle through it. So I would say it took, it really took my symptoms becoming quite extreme. So fatigue, so grueling that I couldn't really function. I would go teach my class. I was teaching a class at Princeton, and I would collapse on the train and just pass out to the point that the conductors would have to wake me up, in the afternoon after a perfectly normal night of sleep, right? So that was not typical. I was like, this seems unusual. So I think it just took things like that. I was driving home with a colleague, and I looked at him and I was like, I have no idea who this person is. I know them, but I don't know who they are. I don't know their name. I don't know how I know them, how long I've known them. So, coming home and saying to my husband, like, is this normal? He was like, no, I think not. So I think having a supportive partner who did start to say, something really seems wrong. And then just a lot of persistence. I am trained to be a journalist. So I think at that point I started to be like, I need some answers. I have to start asking questions. And I just started asking a lot of questions from friends. I see a lot of questions here about like, how do we get care? I mean, I had no idea how to get care. My doctor was just saying, you seem fine. Maybe you need to take some iron supplements. So I started asking, do you know anyone who's experienced something like this? If so, who did they see? Where did they go? I started hearing about integrative medicine, which I knew nothing about. And I started going to integrative doctors, hearing what they had to say, and then just Googling and reading as much as my brain would allow me to read, and joining patient groups. I mean, patient groups were like instrumental to, it was in essence, a form of like, it felt like a form of radicalizing. In retrospect, I'm like, no, that was like a form of normalizing that everyone needs. And I think patient groups really helped educate me about why what felt to me like an assortment of really disparate, unconnected symptoms might in fact all be connected and might have root causes like mold exposure or genetics that made it hard for me to detoxify certain things or methylate certain vitamins. Viruses, I had all these viruses that kept recurring, then the possibility of tick-borne illness. So I almost created like a map, and I would just go explore each aspect of this and see if it might relate to me and my health. But I think what was really helpful in that period in kind of gunning up the courage to do it and to persevere was those patient groups and organizations, which helped me see that the fact that I had recurrent Epstein-Barr virus was probably connected to whatever was going on. The fact that I had all these food sensitivities probably connected. Okay, what else should I explore? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And I think that's a real tragedy of this, right? Beyond the physical is the emotional and psychological impact that it has on people who are questioning themselves. If you have a cold, you know you are sick. If you have a physical injury, that you don't have to go in and convince somebody that you have broken an ankle. They take your x-rays and they know you have it. But here it's trying to convince the medical profession and even people who you feel like are in your corner sometimes that you're sick and that this is something that is really difficult.
I
want to shift gears for a second and talk about primarily it's around long COVID, but other post-infection diseases too, the amount of misinformation that is out there, and how can patients and other allies help with that. You are a journalist, you have looked at this, you have followed the science, you have talked to a lot of other people. How do we deal with that?
The misinformation.
Yeah. And how can maybe people who are watching this, is there anything they can do to help?
It's really hard. I mean, I've just said how much patient groups helped me. I will also say that I was in some that certainly were full of misinformation at the same time. And I think that one thing, how can I put it? I think that where there are no answers, right, or not enough answers, narrative creeps in, right? And this is something I talk about in my book, that we each make our own personal narrative of what we either know happened to us or we think happened to us. And in my own case, I don't still exactly know what happened or is continuing to happen. I have some really strong clues, and I've strung together narratives that really make sense to myself. But there were points in my illness journey where I thought, okay, it's all about food sensitivity and the microbiome, right? Definitely healing the gut, working on my microbiome was hugely important and remains important in my illness journey. But I think I almost became exclusively focused on that to the extent of neglecting, well, do I need to get tested again for tick-borne illness? Do I need to explore mold, exposure, things like that? So one thing, I'm answering a slightly different question, which is I'm sort of saying there's misinformation out there, and then there's sometimes also correct information for other people that's not our personal correct information. So I think all of us have to become, in essence, journalists and sleuths about our own body and our own experience, because my sense is that the reality of the complex chronic illnesses we're talking about is that there can be multifactorial, there can be multiple factors creating our particular condition. And many of us actually live with more than one diagnosis. Certainly I do. And also how I'm experiencing that particular illness changes, right? The disease itself changes. So there's the larger question of misinformation that I think we all have to be really vigilant about and interested in learning the whatever the truth is. as opposed to what narrative we might have become attached to. I think that's what's unifying. What I'm saying is that there were different times in my journey where I became attached to a simpler answer that I now think was what's going on for me. And so my experience of being sick has been one of peeling layers back constantly, like an onion, and also of, recognizing that there's some outright information that's wrong out there. Then there's a lot of information where no one really knows, and a lot of people are saying they do know. And I have to bring a healthy skepticism to that, and also just an interest in what's helping me live a better life. And then there's some hard and fast information, right? And what we need is the misinformation will die away the more information there is, right? So I think not making sure we're not spreading misinformation, by accident, and then just staying alive to alert to possibility that we, that there's more to our own story than we even know yet. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As a journalist yourself, so one of our participants asked the question, can you share any insights about how to approach healthcare journalists to interest them in following developments in post-infection disease research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I try to appeal to their intellectual curiosity and say, I know how busy you are, but I think you might be interested in this study that just came out, or this cluster of studies, or I've been talking to, I will now say to my GP pretty directly, I've had a COVID exposure. I thought I might have COVID. And so I've been reading a lot about microclots, and I know I have a clotting tendency. So I was like, would you be open to putting me on blood thinners if I get COVID, to see how that goes? Because there's a lot of research showing, that microclots are in the bodies of people with long COVID. And that's an area of research. And it's very but could we talk together about benefit and risk? Right. And she was like, yes. I'm not comfortable putting you on this kind of blood thinner because if you were in a car accident, you could die, but I'm comfortable putting you on this. This is the risk to you. This could be the potential benefit. So I think that's part of what I mean about finding the right practitioner. Like, mine is really interested in communicating with me. She's really open to hearing about research. She will say, this makes me nervous, but the risk here seems really low and the benefit seems potentially high. So I think that's a great way to go about engaging your GP, is the language of risk and benefit is, I think, a familiar language to them, right? And I think if we can put it that way, that like, yes, this is a little bit not fully substantiated yet by, randomized control, but here's what I see as the potential risks and benefits. What do you see? And engaging them as a partner, I think, could be a way to get them quite curious. And then I think just saying, again, I know how limited your time is. Here's a page on this organization site that explains what I'm talking about really clearly. Would you be willing to look at it before the next meeting? I think also just acknowledging how strapped physicians are for time and healthcare workers are for time makes them feel less like they're being besieged by us and more like they're being brought along as a partner, and that's something I try to keep front of mind, is just how much is on their plates that I don't know about. Yeah.
So that's on the medical side. How about for us getting more information out there about the research that is being done? A lot of people here are very into that and very active. Are there ways that we can reach out to journalists to get them interested in writing about some of this?
Yeah, I think the challenge with the media is the media always wants a story that hasn't been told yet, right? And wants it to feel kind of dramatic. But I do think that framing what's happening as this paradigm shift in medicine, that there's really this coming understanding of a totally different way of thinking about individual health that is about the intersection of kind of genes and environment and exposure to pathogens, and that there's just a lot of unexplored territory there that is ripe for rich storytelling, is the way to go. I think also being really savvy about the media and how the media works is helpful. I see a lot of times, there have been a few not so great long COVID stories out recently, in my view, not the most intellectually rigorous. I see a lot of times advocates and organizations call for retraction. as a journalist, I always think that's the wrong strategy because magazines will almost never retract an article. And in fact, it can look less savvy to ask for that. So I always think focus instead on really specific either errors, or be really clear that such and such isn't technically an error, but it's a misunderstanding of what a reasonable person would think if they read the research, right? And sort of really being very precise in the feedback that we're giving to the media, a little bit less, as outraged as we all are, just like trying to be very action item oriented, like reasonable assessment of this research would suggest it's not psychological in nature. There are these biological underpinnings. Here's what they are. I do think putting together kind of tip sheets or cheat sheets, as it were, for journalists. Most journalists, a lot of people are really curious, but they don't know how to weigh and read the different things that they're. So if they see a study from Harvard saying, there's a lot of anxiety and depression in people with long COVID before they had long COVID, a lot of journalists just don't know how to interpret that information. They're not going to be able to contextualize it. So I think the more that as advocacy organizations and advocates, we can do some of that contextualizing, bringing up the things that might be used to psychologize our condition and saying, here's what you might think reading this. Here's why a more nuanced interpretation is needed. Here's the other things you might think about. I think the more context-based information we can give, the better. And I think we can really make a lot of change in that way, if that makes, yeah.
Mm-hmm. In your book, The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness, you talk with a friend of yours who's a philosopher, and about healthy people's tendency to disbelieve sick people who lack a clear diagnosis, but nonetheless insist that they are ill. And your friend said, quoting from the book, recognizing your suffering puts a burden on me. Just the act of recognizing you are ill makes a claim on me, doesn't it? I have to respond. I have to empathize. And the more people I have to empathize with, the harder it is. I know this is not something we necessarily want to talk about, but or acknowledge, but I think it is something important for everybody to know, right? That when you reach out to somebody for support, there may be another reason why you're not getting that support. Is that the correct characterization?
Yeah, this was such an interesting moment. So this was someone I really trusted, who's a moral philosopher. So he studies moral philosophy. And there's a joke that, of course, moral philosophers never know actually how to act with other humans. But, I said to him, why do you think, why are, if not just hundreds, but thousands and potentially millions of people are going to the medical system saying something's really wrong with me, I know it is, and the medical system saying, no, you're fine, this is anxiety, or, why on earth are people so invested in not recognizing the reality of other people's testimony? And what he said is this: because your suffering puts a burden on me. And I kind of immediately was like, and annoyed. And he was like, no, you have to think about it. Like it puts a kind of claim on me to empathize. That's how a philosopher would think about it. And I think what he was further getting at, and what my book tries to get at, is that claim to empathize is actually all the more complicated when we don't have a solution, right? And in American culture, broadly speaking, and maybe in the West, even more broadly speaking, I think we're really bad at telling stories about uncertainty, modeling uncertainty, and living with uncertainty. And so part of what the reimagining chronic illness that I'm talking about in my book is trying to create a space where we tell stories of uncertainty, and we talk about what it's like to live without answers. And in a way, I hope to normalize it, right? So I think it is true that our suffering puts a burden on others. It puts a claim on them. I think that it is also, as I argue, part of the human condition that we owe recognition of that suffering, right? We do. We're all going to suffer in different ways. That's what it is to be mortal. And to avoid that reality, traps everyone in a cycle, actually, of failure and discomfort. So I think that part of the work I'm asking all of us to do, and asking healthy people to do, able-bodied people to do, is to think about their own discomfort with chronic illness, and to start making room for witnessing it without feeling they have to solve it. And I think the more that we can normalize and tell stories of witness without solution, the more that the people in our lives will start to understand this is really hard for her. It feels like something I've gotten used to, but she's never going to get used to it, right? But I don't have to solve it to be helpful. My husband often will be like, well, I didn't say anything because I can't do anything for you. And I'll say to him, just stopping and acknowledging how bad it is for me in that moment is an act of doing. It's a positive act of witness, right? And so I think the flip side of your suffering puts a burden on me is the idea that my act of witnessing, is all that I can offer, and it's enough right now, right? And maybe over time that witnessing leads to advocacy, leads to other kinds of support. We can also, people can do what they can in their own way, but just to actually radically witness in your own world is huge. It's actually a radical act. So I think that's the flip side of it, that maybe we can articulate to our loved ones, I don't need an action from you other than witnessing, and maybe that helps them start to take on that burden. But I think that just as we've made advances in how we think about accessibility and disability, we need to make advances in how we think about the reality of chronic illness and make that something that is more normalized and woven into the fabric of everyday life.
I'm going to pause here. We're going to take some more questions. We've had them coming in throughout the chat, but if any of our audience has questions for Meghan, feel free to enter them in the question. We'll start to take some. One is actually from a doctor and a director of a long COVID clinic. And he quotes Dr. Gawande by saying, nothing is more threatening to who you think you are, I assume as a physician, than a patient with a problem you cannot solve.
Mm-hmm.
So that this is kind of along what we were just talking about with people who are presenting doctors who are used to solving problems throughout their whole life. That's part of how they got to be doctors, was taking tests, having answers. Now we're asking them to solve something that they don't know. Mm-hmm. As a patient, what would be helpful for you to hear when a doctor experiences this, but still wants to express their concern? And I suppose that could also tie into the last answer too, that as just a person you're telling, or a family member or a spouse, what does it help to hear someone say for you to feel recognized and validated?
It's such a great and important question. So thank you for that question. I had this neurologist early on, she's still my neurologist, who I went to her with the electric shocks finally and had met her for the first time. And by now I was a little bit, I don't know, I just felt like I would tell people this and they would sort of act as if I was exaggerating. And she just listened to the story and she said, you are not the only patient who has come to me and described this phenomenon. I don't know what it is, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to help you, but I completely believe that this is happening to you, and I can see that that it's severe and that it is impacting you profoundly. And I can't tell you how profound that was and how helpful, actually materially helpful it was, because it just made me feel like someone else cared. She went on to say, we're doing a few research studies around, small fiber neuropathy. You might have that. I don't know if you participate, we won't have a cure for you, but maybe you'll feel like you're adding to human knowledge. And in the meantime, I just empathize with you. And here's something we might try. Here's another thing we might try. None of it's perfect, and just that, it just made me feel like I was part of something instead of this, someone who had just been kind of cast adrift into the universe with an unknown plight that no one would ever show interest in. And I think what maybe physicians don't know, because the experience of not knowing is such a painful one for physicians, is that you do hold so much weight in the lives of chronically ill patients, and your care actually has material impact on us, whether or not it you have an answer. And one of the really fascinating things that I talk about in my book that I came across is that how many studies show that an empathetic doctor who takes time to be warm has a huge beneficial impact on their patient's symptoms, even in the absence of other kinds of medical intervention. Sometimes an impact that's as great as the best medical intervention or medication we have, which when you really stop to think about it is like a stunning finding that gets repeated in various areas, but that just empathetic interaction literally changes the experience of symptoms of the patient. And that's a really powerful thing that everyone has in their bandwidth if they were able to not feel threatened by the not knowing, but actually use that not knowing to show extra warmth and care.
Going back into the sort of specifics of having the illness, the question was asked about the difficulties of explaining fatigue to doctors and to loved ones, friends, family even.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't understand or believe the impact, right? How many patients have heard, oh, just increase your exercise, which we know is an antithetical solution to what it is. How do you explain that fatigue?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think now I can explain it in various ways because I, over the course of my, illness journey, was diagnosed with untreated tick-borne illness and also with something called hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and also with something called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So both, or POTS. So both POTS and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome can bring with them fatigue. So we do know some things about that. So I'm starting to be able to kind of concretize my own personal experience of fatigue for people. But I think that more broadly, we actually need a revolution in how we talk about what we're calling fatigue. And that revolution needs to start with research, and we need more language, we need more vocabulary, because I think that there's different kinds of fatigue. Fatigue is not tiredness, right? When it's pathological, it might be that your mitochondria which produce energy, are not functioning correctly. It might be that you have microclots and not enough blood flow is happening in your brain. It might be that you have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and your muscles are contracting a lot to kind of stabilize your body, and that's fatiguing to you. It might be that you have post-exertional malaise, right? And we still don't know enough about what that is, what it is biologically. So when it comes to fatigue, I think that the conversation in a medical office needs to be GPs really understanding the ways in which that word is a very general term for a symptom that the patient is experiencing, that the person is experiencing, that could be triggered by many pretty severe organic causes. And that symptom needs to be taken very seriously. And, in the absence, again, of knowledge, we need to try to help people live the lives they're living, right? So try to identify, okay, is your fatigue worse at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day? Does anything trigger it? Does movement trigger it? Like many of us can have a crash after we exercise. I think really we need to educate the medical community and be in a more open conversation about how do we differentiate different kinds of fatigue. And we need tools to do that. Better questionnaires, more interest, fundamentally more research, but before we get there, like better questionnaires could elicit a lot of information, I think.
Meghan, thank you very much. We really, really appreciate your time talking to us. Again, Meghan's book is The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness. I imagine it is available everywhere you can buy books. And again, you are a finalist for the 2022 National Book Award. So this is quality stuff, folks. This is not, this is good, really good stuff. Meghan, thank you for taking the time today. I just want to, we actually have some people, we have a drawing and we have some winners of your book that we will be sending. So congratulations to our winners of The Invisible Kingdom. And we have all your email addresses. It was for everybody who registered for the webinar. So we will be reaching out to you to get a shipping address so we can send that to you. And again, I just want to remind everybody that it's all, we provide grants to fund research into the things we talked about today, treatments and cures. We advocate in Washington for more research dollars and for more recognition of the disease so that we can ultimately better educate everybody about it. And if you'd like to contribute, this is how you would do so. And we appreciate it. Meghan, again, thank you so much. If you want the last word, it's yours.
I'll just say thank you so much to everyone for coming. I see there were a lot of questions in the chat, and I know there's so many questions when we live with or care for people with these complex chronic illnesses about which too little is known. And I really wrote the book to animate that experience, and just wishing the best to everyone here and hoping we find more answers soon.
Thank you very much. All right, everyone, thank you for attending. We have other ways, that you can keep in touch with us if you would like. Here are ways to connect with us on social media. And in addition, if you would like to be involved in the other things that we do, attending future webinars, driving research, funding progress, you can also even join our registry and biobank, which doctors are using to do research, so you can be part of the research. So you can check it at our website at any of these places. Thank you very much, everybody. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you again, Meghan. Everybody have a great day.
All right, thank you.